Welcome to week 2 of our Corona Correction webinar series. I'm Zan Ali, the CEO of Centura Global, and I'm joined today by Kenzo Onomonu, Senior Legal Counsel for Entrepreneur First, and Lena Patel, Corporate and Commercial Solicitor for Grant Source Solicitors. Now, today we're going to be discussing legal issues surrounding coronavirus-related disruption to business. So we're going to look at how businesses can manage their contracts and third-party relationships, steps companies can take to ensure that they're legally safe both now and in the future, and also the startup funding landscape. So I hope you enjoy it.
To start with, I want to pose a question for both of you. So coronavirus has obviously affected everyone. So what is the first thing you would advise businesses do from a legal perspective? So let's go with Lena first.
From a legal perspective, I think it's important to look at your contractual obligations first to see how they're affected. So first of all, for contractors for parties to a contract who are looking at whether they are affected by the coronavirus, you need to sort of first see whether those parties are dependent on other suppliers who might be affected, or are those suppliers affected by ongoing chains or other manufacturers as well to those contracts. You'd want to look at the revenues and assess the streamlines. And if you're looking to make cuts, for example, in your business, it's important to have a look at the staff, reducing salaries, or, for example, can you get out of any leases now that we're on a lockdown or working from home, and also sort of assessing any loans as well that the government can provide to your company, or any access to any further loans with commercial lending.
Great, thanks. Kenzo, do you have anything further to add to that?
Agree with everything that Lena has sort of highlighted. The only other thing I would say is try and to think about what your business actually does and whether you'll have runway to continue doing that, and what you might need to do in terms of further fundraising, whether that's private equity or bank lending.
Okay, great. So let's say you're a business, you've got all these contracts, you've had a look, you've reached out to some of your partners and you're trying to negotiate and come to some sort of agreement since everyone's been affected. But let's say the other side isn't playing ball. You can't reach an agreement and you sort of need to escalate this. You need to look at your contract and see how you can maybe enforce some of this. What can you do, Lena?
So if you're looking to enforce certain obligations within the contract, the first thing that I would look out for is a force majeure clause. So those clauses are used to excuse or delay the performance, sort of where unforeseeable circumstances arise, which prevent a party from fulfilling a contract. The underlying principle of this clause is that on the occurrence of certain events happening, a party is excused from the performance from all or part of its obligations. And usually we would see that this is an express clause within the contract, which is definitely something to look out for.
Okay, so do you think force majeure applies to coronavirus?
I really think it's on a case-by-case basis. There isn't a sort of one-size-fits-all clause for coronavirus. The thing is, this pandemic is so unusual. It's something that none of us have ever encountered before. So I definitely think it's worth discussing whether the clause applies depending on sort of when the contract was entered into. For example, if the contract was entered into let's say the end of February or the beginning of March, we would have known that coronavirus would have been in the reasonable contemplation of the parties. However, if it was entered into last year, no one can have foreseen that this would have taken place.
Okay, makes sense. So let's say it's arguable that it does apply. You've gone into your contract, you do have a force majeure clause. How do you practically enforce this? So what do you do as a company that wants to take advantage of this clause?
So if we're looking at sort of practically enforcing the clause, really you'd have to look at the contract, and if you're deciding to seek relief by relying on the force majeure clause, you must be able to show that the non-performance of the contract is due to the coronavirus outbreak. For example, in other words, the party must otherwise be ready and willing to perform the contract. So a party seeking relief needs to provide evidence of sort of how they've been impacted by the coronavirus, whether this has hindered or sort of prevented any contractual obligations from taking place. And if you're going to enforce this, then do you want to pause the contract? Do you want to suspend the provision of services, or do you want to terminate it? Those are definitely sort of certain different factors that parties are going to want to look into before sort of acting upon this clause.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess it's quite important for any company that's having issues to consider what are your objectives. So what do you want to achieve with any negotiations you have? Do you want to put it on pause? Do you want to terminate, as Lena just said? So if you have that in mind before you look to enforce, before you even look to negotiate, that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Also, I mean, we have to look at the test as well for force majeure, because there needs to be a certain criteria for the satisfaction of the clause to apply. For example, it must be out of the reasonable control of the affected party, the affected party's ability to perform its contractual obligations should have been prevented or sort of hindered by the event. And there's also the most important step is reasonable steps should have been taken to mitigate the event or the consequences of the event.
Okay, so let's go with an example. So let's say you're a distributor. So you've got manufacturers in China. They've got factories out there. You collect those goods, you distribute to a number of retailers in the UK. So you've got agreements on both sides of the table. So a bunch of factories have now closed in China. Those manufacturers are not supplying you the goods that you have covered in your agreement. You're now no longer able to distribute those to the retailers, but equally a lot of the retailers are closed, but then again, online delivery. So you've got a retailer chasing you and you're chasing the manufacturer, but their factory's closed. So what can you do in that kind of situation?
I mean, really, it comes down to sort of every contract are going to be different. But for example, in this circumstance, perhaps the supplier could seek alternative manufacturing lines or different suppliers, or seek alternative suppliers to ensure that their manufacturing business and supply chain is ongoing. They really need to make sure that they've taken every avenue possible to ensure that reasonable steps have been taken to mitigate the losses that will be incurred to the other parties in the contract.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, Kenzo, just moving on to you. You obviously work with a number of entrepreneurs or funded companies. Have you seen many contractual issues arise over the last few weeks or couple of months? What have you seen crop up?
I'd say I've seen less sort of contractual issues arise, outside of what's normal for any business at the moment in these current circumstances. And just to kind of add to what Lena said, I think it's important as a business to think about what else you can do to mitigate the effect of the coronavirus in terms of your contractual relationships. So an example I'd use is television rights. The Premier League, for instance, having to suspend a number of their live broadcasts and their games. The broadcasters, BT and Sky, could technically rely on force majeure provisions and potentially collect a refund from Premier League clubs. But they may look to actually use the fact that the situation has arisen to negotiate better rights in the future and to stop them from having to sort of make refund demands. So I think a lot can be said for how else you can mitigate the effects of the coronavirus. In terms of kind of entrepreneurs, the main impact that we've seen from the coronavirus outbreaks is really to revenue, and that's very specific to the type of business you are. Fortunately for Entrepreneur First, we have a fairly diverse portfolio. So some of the companies have, like other companies, done really well out of the virus outbreak, and some have done not so well, which is expected in a fund and a portfolio of our size. But I think the key thing for entrepreneurs is to just seriously look at sort of your runway and your burn rate, and how long it's going to be until you can raise money again. And that will come down to how well you can manage your costs and efficiencies you can make, if at all, really.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I've just looked at the Q&A. I'm going to come to that at the end, but there's a question that sort of fits in with what you've just said, Kenzo. So it says the government hasn't offered much support for startup companies who are seriously having issues with cash flow. So what kind of advice would you offer to a company in that position above what you just said?
I think the first thing I would do is speak to your current investors, to see whether there's anything that they can do in terms of bridging loans or anything like that. You could also speak to banks and to see whether there are any packages that banks are offering at the moment to help small businesses and entrepreneurs, whether that's grants or commercial loans. But I think this scenario and this virus is going to affect everybody, not so much in equal measure. But I think one thing that would be really important is to forensically go through your costs and your balance sheet, maybe with an investor if you have them available, or with any advisor that you have on your board, to see where it would be sensible to become more cost efficient, whatever that might look like for your specific business.
Okay, great. So let's say people have looked at force majeure, they've decided they don't want to use it, they're looking for other options. Lena, do you have any other suggestions for other ways people can enforce contracts?
Yeah, so another option might be not obviously in every case, but to look at the frustration clause. So the frustration really results in the contract automatically coming to an end, where the parties to the contract will no longer be bound to perform their future obligations. But the threshold for frustration is much higher than force majeure. So the underlying event is not the fault of any party to the contract, and the event or circumstance which occurs from the contract should not have been foreseen by any of the parties. And if frustration occurs, then it should be sort of commercially impossible to fulfill the obligations under the contract. Now, a scenario sort of during these coronavirus times would be the inability to perform a contract due to, for example, having to self-isolate an office or a team within a building due to the outbreak of coronavirus at a workplace. So under many sort of force majeure clauses, this would likely to have necessary impacts on the link to qualify as a force majeure event. But really, again, that's not to say that people should not mitigate their risks. And if coronavirus could have been foreseen at the time, then it's all the more important to do so.
Sure. Okay, so another issue that I've seen quite a few clients facing is actually around their relationship with their investors, Kenzo. So, for example, certain disputes have arisen where some of the portfolio companies, they're not happy with the level of assistance investors are granting them. In your opinion, what role do you think VCs and other private investors should be playing at the moment? And are there actually any duties that they owe to their portfolio companies?
It's difficult to say sort of without seeing individual documents between companies and investors whether duties are owed. But I think generally in the market, being invested in is a privilege, and that privilege arises when you've done really well as a business and shown that you have real growth potential, and investors are willing to support that. And I think in times of crises like this, it's always at the investor's discretion as to whether or not to make an investment in you. I think market practice would probably be to kind of, if term sheets have been signed, to honour those term sheets, but that's not always the case. And that might be for a number of reasons. When we drill down and think about sort of the way funds are structured and the way investors sort of deploy capital, it may make a lot of sense as to why their capital is being reserved for the real superstars. So an example I'd use is with any fund, typically, that is able to deploy capital, the capital will have already been raised at this stage. It's not that, there is no money to deploy. It's just that investors might be more careful about where they deploy their capital now because they don't know when they're going to be able to raise again from their limited partners. And with private investors, it might be that they invest speculatively aside from their normal job or with their private wealth. And it might be that in these times, they relax that approach and become more frugal with their capital and where they put it. So I can see that it's understandable that some investors will have pulled back in this current climate. Whether, you can kind of apply a broad reasoning to that and give a specific reason, I'm not sure about, and I think it'd be difficult to do, but I can certainly understand why there's been sort of a difference in investors in relation to portfolio companies.
Sure. I mean, that's an interesting point you make about limited partners. So I'm not sure if everyone in the audience fully understands the VC structure. So I'll give a very basic high level overview, but essentially you have the people who manage the fund. They go out and they look for investors. Those investors are called limited partners, and they'll put set sum into the pot, which is the fund, which the managers then manage. They go look for startup opportunities to invest in. But with limited partners, typically the agreements say that the money is going to come in certain stages. So have you seen a case right now, Kenzo, where the LPs aren't fulfilling their contractual obligations to deliver the sums they should be?
No, I haven't come across any cases like that. But there's a bit of an echo. No, I haven't come across any cases like that. I think in terms of drawdown commitments, they kind of happen at the start of the fund. So it'd be quite unusual. LPs kind of pulled back from drawdown commitments. I think what would be more typical is for LPs to say to managers, be more careful about where you're putting your funds, because we don't know when we're going to be able to, when you're going to be able to raise another fund or we're going to be able to fund you again.
Okay, sure. So then let's say you've already, there's a question here which says we had an investor who committed to funding in January. Then as a result of the crisis, they pulled out. Is there any way we can enforce that investment if it was agreed?
And as I said, it'd be very difficult to say without seeing what agreements exist in place between that company and that investor. But I'd certainly say it's something worth exploring. The other thing you've got to think about is how the investor is going to behave in the market, and from a comms perspective, whether pulling out investments is going to have any reputational damage.
I think there's a slight echo on your side, Lena. Cool, thanks. Yeah, so on that point, do you think there's a knock-on effect where term sheets and ongoing negotiations are being affected from the coronavirus? So you're saying that investors are going to be a bit more careful about where they invest their money and when they deploy it. So with ongoing negotiations and people backing off, has that been a big issue? Have you seen investors behave a little bit inappropriately?
I think there has been some bad behavior from investors, and I think that might be because they are affected by this crisis as well. And, as much as everybody will be panicked, they'll be part of that in some respects. But I think in terms of term sheets and in terms of money available in the market, I don't think that, there is necessarily less money. I think that there's just a higher concentration of that money going into very good companies. So I think if you are a great company, there will still be plenty of capital available for you in the market. But it might be that, you know, the companies that were weak yeses or strong maybes have less of an opportunity to raise capital in the current climate.
Okay, so I guess if you've got a strong proposition, a solid company, you should feel more confident. And if you're struggling, then there's actually an opportunity here to pivot and take advantage of the situation to deliver a more valuable solution that investors might be excited about.
Correct, or consolidate your business. I think the good thing about early stage companies is that they are still in the stage at which they can pivot and they can kind of weather the storm while they're still in the R&D stage. If you look at companies like Deliveroo or companies like Airbnb, they are more susceptible to taking huge hits in a market like this because they're fully established and they rely on the huge revenues that they bring in.
Yeah. Okay. So then we're kind of talking about how people can manage this situation and what they can do. And we've looked at what people can do with existing relationships. But I just wanted to come to you, Lena, to see do you have any advice on how businesses can mitigate future risks with any new agreements that they enter into?
Yeah, so if someone wants to mitigate this, I mean, I would always recommend terms to mitigate any sort of future contracts. But if a party is looking to, sorry, Zan, I think there's a slight echo on your end. Thanks. So if a party is looking to mitigate their risks, then they'd want to take reasonable steps to do so with the event to make sure that there's no alternate means for performing the contract, and it's very fact specific, so it depends on the nature and the subject of the matter, but they'd also want to consider sort of the limitations on their liability. So, for example, even if a contract has nothing direct to say about coronavirus itself, the contract may contain limitations or exclusions on liability. Clauses might sort of cap liability in the future, or the party's ability to recover from a counterparty. So clauses such as those might want to be sort of put into terms to limit any liability in the future. And also, for any party, you should always have a look at your insurance cover as well, to make sure that you're covered for these sort of disruptions in the future. Right now, obviously, it's difficult to get insurance to cover coronavirus, but this is definitely something that all parties should be looking at.
So pretty much people should speak to their lawyers, get some advice on how to renegotiate or add certain terms into their contract, and also get insurance. So you're saying to do both?
Both, yeah.
Okay, fair point. So I just wanted to move on to discuss WeWork briefly. Sorry, Lena, do you mind muting your mic? Thanks. So I wanted to move on to WeWork, and they've been in the news quite a lot over the past year because they've had a lot of issues. They tried to go for an IPO. They put a microscope on the company. A lot of stuff came out. But they've been in the news again in the last few days because SoftBank, who are their largest shareholder, and offered to offer them $10 billion last October, I think it was, $10 billion. They've now pulled out of that deal, and WeWork are suing them. And I just think this is interesting from multiple perspectives, from the investor startup relationship, from the potential agreements being broken. And one of the things with WeWork is they've also suffered a lot from the coronavirus. So they've been hit hard with tenant occupancy across all locations, dropping to, I think, 64% were the latest statistics I saw. So pretty much over a third of their desks globally are empty. with existing tenants. A lot of them are looking for rent holidays, or apparently some have even just stopped paying and removed their bank details from the servers, which is a breach of their agreements. So there's kind of multiple streams we can go with this. And I've seen there's a question in the Q&A which says, we'd like to break our office agreement, but we signed up for a year. Can we do this now? And are we liable? Now, I know none of us are commercial property lawyers here, so it might not be a direct area of expertise, but I don't know if either of you have any opinions on that one.
So I'd always recommend sort of speaking with the landlord. It's not definitely something that you can just automatically assume, just to say that, you know, due to coronavirus, we don't have to pay our rent anymore. I think that's something that people are, it's a little bit of a misconception at the moment, where people are automatically assuming that they're entitled to a rent break straight away, which I don't think is the case. I think it's more of having that discussion with the landlord and coming to an agreement, or for example, if it's not a rent holiday, perhaps making reduced payments or deferring certain payments, just to make sure that it's viable, because equally the landlord doesn't want to lose their tenants, but equally so the tenants don't really want to lose their place of work or sort of commercial business unit either.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think there is a balance there. So you can't just stop paying. I mean, if you can negotiate a rent holiday, I mean, in the UK, for example, the government have said that no tenant can be evicted, whether it's residential or commercial, for not paying rent over the next couple of months. But that being said, you should still speak to your landlords and try and come to an agreement. You can't just breach that agreement. But then going back to the wider scope of WeWork, Kenzo, do you have any opinions on this whole kind of saga over the past year, and now what SoftBank have been doing and pulling out?
I mean, yeah, it's a really interesting situation, because it's, you know, another kind of tech-based property company that is effectively unicorn status, and you know what we've seen is a perceived valuation kind of not to be lived up to, if you like, and that valuation dropped a few times over the last year. What I find really interesting about the situation is, from a comms perspective and from a reputational perspective, where it leaves WeWork and SoftBank in the market afterwards to have such a public dispute. I think that that's going to be really interesting, probably more so for SoftBank than for WeWork. It's probably obvious, in fact, it's clearly obvious, that SoftBank have a lot of capital to deploy, and companies are always going to be willing to talk to SoftBank, but sort of pulling out of a deal like this, and to be honest, we don't know whether there were certain kind of conditions precedents or the loopholes that had to be jumped through or met before the deal was concrete, or before the deal was definitely going to go ahead. But optically pulling out of a deal at this stage in the market might spook companies in terms of working with SoftBank in the future.
Sure. I mean, they're a big investor, a massive company. But WeWork's reputation has been damaged so much over the past maybe 6 months or so, that maybe they're hedging their bets and thinking, you know, no one wants to be on this ship, let's jump ship. But equally, like you said, it will spook a lot of companies, because you don't want your investors to behave that way.
Yeah, and it's their prerogative to be able to do that. As I say, we haven't seen kind of any terms. There may have been some very clear conditions precedent before any deal could go ahead, and WeWork may not have met certain milestones which allowed SoftBank to pull out the deal. We just don't know that. But you know, it's not unusual when a company hasn't performed as well as an investor would have liked it to, for an investor to kind of pull out, or a potential buyer to pull out of a deal.
Okay, going slightly off topic here, but you mentioned, or you described WeWork as a prop tech company. So I find it interesting, because obviously WeWork have an app which all of their tenants can use and connect with, but are they really a tech company? And is it just a way of glamorizing a standard office space?
I would probably agree with you. I think they are probably, you know, a property company who are able to offer part of their services on a tech platform, as opposed to any unique tech around renting office space. I think it would have been a mistake for WeWork to kind of offer their services without, the ability for people to log in remotely and do things online, because you can pretty much do that everywhere now. So I think that's probably a fairer description of them, a property company that has a tech element.
Yeah, I think it's just one example of a few companies in recent times that have kind of, I don't know if not misrepresented themselves, but portrayed themselves in a certain way that isn't necessarily 100% accurate to make them more attractive for investors, to make them look better in the marketplace. And we're seeing a lot of business models that aren't coming through on that basis. So going forward, I think.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. But I think one thing to consider is that investors are super smart, and their DD processes, you would expect them to be super thorough. So any sort of, if you are holding yourself up to be a tech company, it's likely that an investor will want to see some sort of unique tech and the IP behind that to back up your claims and to make them more likely to put some money into.
Sure. So, I mean, with companies like WeWork that have been hit like this and are suffering from revenue shortages, which is a lot of businesses in general at the moment, one of the relief that have been offered by the UK government were interest-free interruption loans. Now, this scheme was launched around 2 weeks ago, but I read on Tuesday that over 300 applications have been made and only 2,000 loans have actually been granted so far, which is, I think that's roughly like 0.65%, which is extremely low. So, Lena, do you have any tips on this kind of loan scheme and any advice for businesses looking to take advantage of it?
Yeah, so just talking about the CBIL loan generally, I mean, it's designed to help sort of small to medium-sized businesses just overcome the difficulties that are going to arise through the coronavirus pandemic. Now, when it first came into force, we initially saw that the lenders were still asking for security requirements, for example, personal guarantees to be entered into. What we've seen now is that those requirements have diluted slightly, where only loans above £250,000 will require personal guarantees. Now, that's quite important because for small business owners, that personal guarantee is a big thing for them to sign up to, and not knowing whether that can be paid back is a big liability for them. In terms of the level of CBIL loans that are actually being issued, without sort of naming any names, it has been seen in the news that some lenders are actually falling behind with issuing out these schemes. We've seen that one bank in particular has had the number of their inquiries sort of quadruple, but they're working at less than 40% of their normal rate, which means that weeks are going past before clients are hearing about sort of whether they can have these loans or not, which sort of means a delay, unfortunately, on their part. The banks are still trying to make up for the increase in the inquiries. Naturally, of course, that's going to skyrocket as these times hit a peak, and businesses are going to want a lot of loans. But unfortunately, we've seen some banks handle it better than others, but there are some lenders that just simply need to catch up a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's such a... Sorry, do you mind muting again? Yeah, I think it's such an unprecedented time and there's so much work that needs to be done. The government's offered a massive relief package for everybody. Everyone's playing catch up and trying to do everything as fast as they can. And when you've got such high volumes of people applying for loans, I mean, it's really frustrating for each individual business, but there is probably going to be some delay. We've just had a question come in which says, will CBILs LS be available for startups that are currently loss-making?
Interesting. I haven't actually, I've not come across this before. I mean, naturally, that I don't expect banks to be lending money that are sort of loss-making, but I mean, everyone's going to be at standstill at the moment, and it really depends on each company. Now, I have heard that a lot of banks aren't taking on new customers, so I believe that CBIL loans are only available to existing customers, but that's only for some lenders. I haven't heard that for every single lender so far.
Okay, I'm quite conscious of the time, and there's a few questions here, so I don't know if either of you have any further points to make before we just go through all of the Q&A questions. Okay.
Yeah, I just had one point to make. A question came up before, was that can the force majeure clause in a contract ever be implied? And ordinarily we wouldn't see this being implied sort of within a contract. The concept of the force majeure clause is likely to be an express clause which will be in a contract. So that's just something to keep in mind. So whenever anyone's looking through their contract, it's probably going to have a non-exhaustive list of events, but whether the particular clause is triggered will depend entirely on the words that the parties have used in the contract. And just one other point was the notice period. If someone wants to terminate their contract, then the affected party's right to the relief for the force majeure clause under the contract will obviously be conditional upon notice being given in accordance with the contract, and some parties might actually adopt an approach where a rolling force majeure notice is being given to take into account sort of the developing impact of the coronavirus and the performance of the obligations.
Okay, that's great. There's actually a question here that says, is there any wording you'd recommend for contracts going forward to possibly protect a little more around force majeure clauses in situations arising like this? I mean, it's probably hard to answer that, and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but I don't know if you have any thoughts, Lena.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said before, there's no sort of one size fits all to account for this. But if you want, I can more than happy to sort of drop you a line, and if you want us to look over any sort of terms and conditions, I'm more than happy to assist you with that after the webinar.
Okay, brilliant. So let's go through these questions one by one. So the top one is that entrepreneurs first, you have many startups that may be going through experiences. It would be really helpful to know how others are managing their challenges. Okay, I'm not entirely sure how much you can say, Kenzo, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, we haven't kind of, I haven't had direct interaction with our portfolio companies in terms of how they're specifically managing this crisis, but I know that there will be a lot of conversations between them, Entrepreneur First, and other investors as well. One of the key things, one of the key value adds to other that investors bring is a wealth of experience in terms of dealing with crises, whether that be kind of like the financial crisis 2008 or 2001, or other financial crises, or kind of changes in the funding environment and landscape generally. So I think having an open dialogue with investors is the first thing that you should be doing. The other thing everybody needs to be doing is focusing on costs. If there are any costs that you are responsible for that you could cut back on, now would be a good time to look into doing that and see whether you can save money. And the reason I mention that is because you will have a certain runway up until you will need to go and ask investors for money again. And I'm sure investors will be asking, what have you done to mitigate the risk of you running out of money whilst this pandemic has been ongoing?
Okay, great. There's another question here. It's a bit of a cheeky one. There are 3 corporate lawyers in this panel. How are you all going to retrain yourself to the raft of new laws and policies that will result after this crisis?
Well, fortunately for
I think it's more of a case where it's just keeping up to date, and obviously there's going to be so many different laws that come off the back of this and so many different government schemes, but really it's just trying I mean, for myself in my particular field, it's just trying to get matters sort of over the line effectively for clients in the way that would best suit them. Obviously, people are going to want to overhaul their terms and conditions now. It's going to be a natural thing that comes from this, but really, it's a learning curve for everyone.
Yeah. What about you, Kenzo?
Well, I think sort of with venture capital, corporate law, you're fairly protected in that there are always going to be investors looking for opportunities and companies looking for funding. Fortunately, at Entrepreneur First, we've got a quite specific program that allows us to create teams with entrepreneurs and create companies that we either invest or don't invest in. So we've got quite a unique ecosystem that will allow us to keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah, I think they're both valid points. I mean, it's just a case of keeping abreast with all the developments, adapting. I mean, one of the key skills of any solid commercial lawyer is to keep up to date and adapt to the times and make sure you're on top of everything. Okay, so here's another question. We are a startup but have not started generating any revenue yet. Can you offer us advice on whether there are investors who will invest in such companies? And if so, where we can go? That's a tricky one. So, I mean, there are obviously investors that invest in companies that aren't yet generating revenue. Typically, they're going to be angel investors. So you're going to have to be able to win them over with whatever your proposition is. Maybe they're already in that same industry sector and they find it attractive. It's a much tougher sell when you don't have revenue, and it may just take more time. And I think given the current situation right now, it's probably going to be even harder. But if you wait a little bit, things will obviously come out of this. There'll also be opportunities. A lot of investors are looking at this thinking we might be able to invest at slightly lower valuations, which might not be great for you in terms of giving away a little bit more equity, but you'll still get that investment. And there are opportunities here. So I don't know what you think, Kenzo.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot will depend on what sector you're in and finding the right investor for your company. And secondly, to Ghazan, your proposition. As I mentioned earlier, there will still be money in the market for good companies. I think, where this is going to really take effect is where companies are kind of, weak yeses and strong maybes, as opposed to very strong yeses, who we expect to continue to raise money and raise well.
Yeah, and I think that kind of covers the next question of advice or tips on how to fundraise successfully during this period. I mean, it's a tough period. It's going to be difficult to fundraise. And I mean, that could probably be a webinar on its own, to be honest. But if you do want follow up on that, feel free to get in touch with us after this webinar. And one last question here. In regards to CBIL, we have been informed by our bank that if you are a company that is over 3 years old, you are not eligible for the loan. Have you come across this?
I've never come across this before, but I'd be interested to know which lender this is. And it's interesting whether all lenders are taking this approach or whether it's just one or certain commercial lenders. So I personally have not come across this before. I know a few companies that are applying for CBIL loans, but I haven't heard this feedback yet.
Great, thank you very much. I think, no more questions, just a compliment. Great speakers and enjoyed the event. So yeah, thank you both very much for your time. I think there've been some fantastic insights there, I hope, for the audience. Just before we go, there is another element to this if people are interested. So the good thing about this platform is that you can network. So once we exit the presentation mode, there are tables, virtual tables. You can click on them and you can then join a video chat with all the people on those tables. So all you have to do is turn your camera and your microphone on and you can have a word. And I think there are tables on the sides. So on the right hand side, there's a table with the Grant Source Solicitors logo. I think Lena's going to be sitting there. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask her, you can jump in there. And Kenzo will be on the left under the Entrepreneur First logo, bottom left. So yeah, if people are interested in networking, go for it. But thank you all very much for attending and thank you very much to the speakers.
And it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.